Le Sigh. So Canada's Gold Cup journey is done, falling in penalties to Guatemala. What does it mean? Let's talk about it. Alright guys, welcome back to What Does It Mean? It's our match reaction. We want to take into the games that we've seen. So we typically do these for every game that we've had. And yeah, if you like this, we are the Africans. We do primarily Canadian and African content. So give us a subscribe if you're into it. If you're Canadian here to just listen to someone vent, I get you. I'm trying to vent well. But if fan of CONCACAF, make sure you give us a like and a subscribe. If you are a fan of just football overall, leave your thoughts on this video because we're going to talk about Canada falling to Guatemala in penalties. So first thing usually I try to do, I am very ADHD, so I'll forget aspects of things, but I said this in the preview earlier. This Guatemalan side is very reminiscent of El Salvador under Hugo Perez in the last cycle. I've really liked what they've been doing over the last two cycles. Well, the last two Gold Cups primarily. And I think they've done a very good job of being a good side. Right, we saw them at the last Gold Cup. They won their group. Which Canada was in. They drew Canada 0-0. And ultimately, I think from there to here, in their group here, giving Panama a run, beating Jamaica and Guadeloupe, I think they've been a side who've been tactically sound, a team that knows how to really push the right buttons in the right moments, great in transition. So am I surprised that they've defeated Canada? No, I think they'd be this type of side that if you got into a type of game which we played today, they could have definitely done something. But I think Guatemala is doing very well, especially to show in terms of what their ability to do, especially coming with World Cup qualifiers coming for them in September, October, November. I think they're a side that you have to look and say they are going to be set and ready, and they are going to be up for every challenge. But Guatemala, I think, deserves their props, their flowers. I think as a Canadian fan, it sucks losing in penalties, but when you take a look at the passion of the Guatemalan fans, the passion of the players, I think it bodes well for this tournament, because if you don't have the Guatemalan fans travel the best, which I guess this will be another thing for me to say. Why can't we have a Central American Gold Cup? Just put the Gold Cup in Central America. Just put it there and then see what happens with it. I think they could do an amazing job, but I'll leave that for now. Let's talk about this game. So Canada ultimately loses it, but let's look at the lineup that we had. So the lineup we had in the back line was pretty standard for what we were expecting. You had Dane St. Clair in goal, Richie Laryea, Derek Cornelius, Luc de Fougeral, and Alistair Johnston. That was your back five, goalie included. And then in the midfield, you had Mathieu Choignard, Nico Seeger. Out wide, you have Jacob Schaffelberg and Tejan Buchanan. And up top, you had Jonathan David and Tani Loeshi. Teni Oluwaseyi. And I think if I look at this lineup, there's two things that I notice that I think are concerns. First is, not that I didn't like Seeger and Choignard starting. I think they earned starts if you want to look at the game that they played against El Salvador. And I think it speaks to what they expected, what Marsh expected from Guatemala. But I do think there is value in terms of getting things right. And I think this is the second time I think I've seen him in big games where maybe the lineup wasn't right. I think from a nine standpoint, they went thinking this would be an up and down transition type game where they would be defending and then you'd want to hit on the transition quickly. But it turned into a game, we said this in the preview, this felt like a game where both teams could easily say, hey, we'll give the ball to the opposite side and say, why don't you be the one to break us down? We want to be on transition. And I think if you try to set in crosses, Tanny had a couple opportunities with crosses where he was just not the right body type for that. That's just the reality of it. And they both got it wrong both times. Against Mexico, when you had Mexico basically taking away all the outside, you needed to be a little bit more tragic, but they were just playing long ball. And so, like, when they eventually put in Daniel Jebison, when the game finally reached the level that it was and was 2-0, you can understand the logic of it. Just wasn't the right call. In this game, they were sending in crosses. They had so many set pieces in the first half, but they didn't have the bodies or set piece running. I think that's a very good, interesting thing as well. The other thing I would say is, I don't think they got their midfield right. Especially when you're looking at, they both deserve the start. I think Sigh and Schweier did. But I think if you take a look at, if let's just say the game was going as it was, you get up 1-0 and you're down a player. Won't you want someone a little bit more defensively sound to see out the game? That would make more sense, but Canada's up 1-0 at half, down a man, and we'll get to that. And the only midfield options were Saliba and Kone. And so I think Marsh mismanaged this game in terms of from a starting 11 to the game that was played and adjusting to it. Now, again, it's tough to adjust when you have a red and a player sent off. But there are just so many aspects where I just feel as if we got this lineup wrong. I think if those three spots, well, really it's those two, right? One of the midfielders I don't think should have been starting there. And in the same breath, I don't think Tanny was the right call for this type of game. I think Tanny in the second half, when you're trying to break out on a transition when you're defending, I think that's a better game. But in possession, I think you want to have Tanny there. Heck, even Kyle Larum would have been a better choice. But before Canada scores their goal in the 30th minute, a penalty that's given, I think you can look at the game and say objectively, this game should have been about, by the time Canada scores, if you factor in Canada's goal, and I know we're playing the what if game, it should have been 3-1, right? Dane has a good save off of a counter opportunity for Guatemala. But then Tayshaun gets a 1v1 opportunity on a cross that reaches him, and he's unable to put the ball on frame. You got to be playing the ball on frame in that situation. And then Joe David gets an opportunity where he gets the goalie out of the box, out of his crease, and is moving. He gets some opportunities, chips it in, and that's an opportunity where you think, hey, I think a player like Promise David, even a Daniel Jebison would have been better suited in that space. Tanny just doesn't have, Tanny's more of a transition 9. So you factor that in, plus you get the goal, you get the penalty that Joe David puts away. That game should have been about 3-1. And I think that's one of the start things from that first half. They were not clinical in their decision making, and they were not clinical decision making. They were given ample opportunities to put the game away in the first half, and they did not. And then that reached the point where then the game turned into a more chippy affair. And look, I've been consistent with the refereeing this game. The only thing that's been consistent for the Gold Cup for refs is if you make any contact in the box, that is a pen. It's going to VAR, it's a pen. Period. That's the only consistent thing that the refs have had this year at the Gold Cup. Everything else has just been a toss-up. And maybe this game is frustration for Canadians after the El Salvador game. Maybe they feel they were beat up a bit too much, but at the end of the day, they had opportunities to put this game away in the first half. But then the temperament of the game got to them, and eventually what happens, they lose their cool. Jacob Schaffelberg picks up a yellow in the 40th minute, and then picks up another yellow in the 45th plus 4 minutes. So 9 minutes later, 2 yellows, and he's off the pitch. Now the second one, if you want to argue and say, hey, that was the wrong call, he runs through off of a set piece from Guatemala. And ultimately what happens is he runs through the player, he's given a second yellow, and he's off. So at this point, you're looking at this game saying, okay, they've kind of lost a goal. Now, other things have happened in this half, right? At about 35 minutes in, Tejan grabs his hamstring. And that becomes a bit of a, oh no, this might be a thing. And I started thinking, okay, who's the sub that they make? But before we even get to take that, I feel that this side is, I mean, there's going to be a lot said about this Canadian side. This is an opportunity that they weren't able to really take advantage of. But I think there is a reality where I think this side is too easily dragged into the mud. They are a team that haven't been able to truly play through a muddy game without running necessarily to the refs. And yes, you want the referees to control you. And about 10 minutes into any game, you know what type of game you're going to have. The refs will make it abundantly clear. And so, as a result, it is just, they've just feels like, and this is not just with Marsh, but the problem with them, I find, is that they are just easily dragged into these situations. Whether it's the brotherhood, the us against them mentality that they have, they are a side that just feels easy to provoke into a game where they're not playing the game and they're fighting the refs and they're fighting the different players. And I think that's just who they are. Maybe with different bodies on the pitch, they can adjust a little bit better. But I just find that if the game gets chippy, they are more than willing. I'd almost say they're eager to get into those schmozzles. And I think that becomes problematic for them. Because instead of just playing through it, they will play to the game. And I feel like in these types of games, if they just play through and force the refs to make these calls. Now, granted, the refs weren't making those calls. So I understand the logic of why you'd be frustrated. But in the same breath, I feel, have to do a better job of just channeling that into playing more football. And if they don't get the calls, walk it off. And there's levels of frustration that gets to, I understand. But I find that this team sometimes too eager to get into those types of games. And where if they just try to play a little bit more, again, it's easy to say it from this perspective. That is a whole conversation in itself. We get to the second half, and then in the end of the first half, about the 40th or so minute, you saw Tejan Buchanan grab his hamstring, and that's a concern. And so I'm already thinking at this point, okay, you probably bring in what? You bring in Jaden Nelson, probably for him, and then you go both sides. But then once Schaffelberg picks up his 2 yellows, you think, okay, so Nelson for Buchanan, and that's how we're gonna run it. But when Tejan was injured, you saw Daniel Jemison start to warm up. Which I guess we entered the let's get nuts version of this game. And ultimately that's what happens once we get to the second half. Now in the first half we saw, they played the same lineup out, but then in the 60th minute, the 58th minute, you have Tejan comes off for Daniel Jemison. And this is now the second time where they can see out a game and they bring on another striker. And I think this is an overall theme of this game. I think Marsh mismanaged this game from the beginning. You want to shut it down, bring in another midfielder. Even in that situation, I think, and it would be tough, I understand why you want to bring a player like Jemison because you want a little bit more pace, but you have Jaden Nelson right there. And Nelson could definitely close in a little bit better. I think you have a better player who can play for a little bit more of that structural integrity that you have. If you go and you play with Nelson, but you go with Jemison, there's moments where Canada in the second half, at the beginning of the second half, they're starting to try to get a counter going, And they very much get to the point where they almost get it, but they can't put it all together. And Canada continue to defend well. Guatemala start to push more and more. There's a moment right before the goal scores in the 60th minute. Rubin gets called for simulation. And you're like, is this going to be this type of a game? But then 69th minute, Rubin off of a great cross from Santis, he puts it in. It's 1-1. And at this point, I think that happens. The next minute, Saliba was already coming on. Saliba comes on for Nico Sigh, which is fine. And then Canada doesn't make another change until the 90th plus 8th minute. Well, 91st minute, where Jonathan David basically has run till he can't run anymore. And this is now the second tournament Jesse Marsch has basically said, this is my lineup, and I'm going to run with this as long as I can. And I think the question for me is, if you're going to be playing such a high press system, doesn't keeping players not only fit, but rotation, keeping them fresh so you can keep up that level, isn't that important? And I don't think all these injuries are their fault, but let's take a look at it. Tejan has a knee injury with this side, probably freak injury. And then from there, then you have Alphonso Davies with an ACL, wear and tear, but then also freak injury. Then you have Sam Adekubi, ACL, wear and tear, but also freak injury. Then you have Ali Ahmed, more of a, again, that's a tackle, you see it on the ankle. That happens. And then Osorio comes in and isn't even healthy, doesn't see him. You add to the fact that you also have Stefan Eustáquio, who isn't released by Porto, however you want to believe, whoever you want to believe. That team is down 3 players, right? That team is down two midfielders and a winger. And I think both would have been very much useful in this game. And we go to penalties. Eventually, the game ends. Promise comes in for Joe David. But it's 4-4. Then both Kyle Aaron and Jose Pinto both miss. Saliba and Altan score. But Luc Fujral hits the crossbar, and then Jose Morales puts it away. This is the second time I've seen a Canada team lose to Guatemala on penalties, where the game breaker was someone hitting a crossbar. That's Justin Smith in the U20s in 2022. So, Canada bows out of the Gold Cup, and you cannot call it anything but a disappointment for them. They came into this year wanting to win a trophy in one of the 2 tournaments, and they didn't even reach the final for either. We did learn things, if you want to go from the most positive standpoint. I think the emergence of Nico Sigh definitely brings up questions as to where they can fit. Luc de Fujral continue to show well. Makes you think maybe that second center back spot might be open and available alongside Moise Bombito. And maybe outside of the midfield, there's a lot of solid midfield players that you can look at and say, okay, maybe one of them is able to push through. But I think second striker, that rotation is always seemingly off, which to me doesn't make sense, because you could easily just put Promise David. Toby can start, and he'd be best suited for both a transition game, but then also playing in the possession, trying to break down a low block. I think out wide, it feels as if we have more questions at winger. Jacob Schaffelberg didn't have a great tournament. Combine that with seemingly a lack of trust and faith in Jayden Nelson means your winger depth is effectively Tejan Buchanan, Ali Ahmed, who also went out injured, and then everything else is a conversation. But I don't think even Ali had a good tournament. And then fullback depth becomes a conversation, because I also do think that a player like Rich Larea is a little bit long in the tooth and may not have the legs for the system unless Marsch actually learns, because this is now the second tournament where he's run the same lineup without trying to keep it fresh. And so for me, That's the biggest thing. I think they're always going to be a high team that can get dragged into these muddy situations, so I don't think it's going to surprise me much. But I do think there is always the availability and there's the potential of improving the depth, and maybe whether it's having a shorter leash on players, whether it's making changes faster, understanding what the flow of the game is. I think Marsh can maybe get better at that, but I think this team as they are what they are. And we know maybe when we see them healthy, they'll look different, but they've been given 2 opportunities in this 2025 year to come away with something, and they have nothing to show for it. So we're set. As we've just finished recording, the U.S. will play Guatemala. They just overcame Costa Rica in penalties. And then Honduras will face Mexico. And that's your semifinal for the Gold Cup. Guys, let me know what you think. And as always, I'm going to stop talking right here.